Magic the Gathering's a game about 5 colors, with each color having different strengths and weaknesses. Because of this, some of the most interesting cards in Magic come from cycles, which are groups of 5 or sometimes 10 cards, where each color or color combination gets 1 card in the cycle. An easy recent example are the Praetors from March of the Machines, which was a 5-card mythic cycle, with white getting Elesh Norn, black Shieldred, green Vorinclex, and so on. When Wizards designs a cycle, ideally all the cards will be somewhat comparable in power, but in practice this doesn't always happen. Some cycles are hilariously unbalanced, with the best card in the cycle being broken and even banned, while the worst card is downright unplayable, and that's our focus today as we look at the least balanced cycles in the history of Magic the Gathering. Number 10. The Ultimatums from Shards of Alara. Best Cruel Ultimatum, worst Clarion Ultimatum. When Wizards finished the Ultimatum cycle in Ikoria, every single card was strong. Sure, like most cycles, some were better than others, but even the weakest of the bunch, which was probably Inspired Ultimatum, offered a ton of value for its 7 mana cost. But this was very much not true of the original Ultimatum cycle in Shards of Alara. Cruel Ultimatum was by far the best of the 5, leading to the iconic 5-color Cruel control deck in Standard, and one of Magic's greatest moments where Gab Nassif tapped his mana for the Cruel Ultimatum that he needed to top deck before drawing his card for the turn.
Nassif forced to play off the top of his deck. He's gonna slow roll all of us, himself included. He's drawn the card face down in front of him and he hasn't even looked at it yet. He's trying to figure out, what can it be? What do I need it to be? Arrange my lands. He's got a sort of sly smile on his face.
My ultimatum mana.
Oh, it's his ultimatum mana. That's the card that he wants. Cruel Ultimatum is the card he's hoping to top deck. And Ultimatum! Off the top! Wow!
Meanwhile, I can't find any record of Clarion Ultimatum seeing play in literally any format. While being able to get 5 additional copies of permanents you already have on the battlefield might sound powerful, the fact is that it does pretty much nothing on an empty board, which makes it super risky to put in your deck. Plus, if you already have 5 permanents that are good enough for Clarion Ultimatum, you're probably winning anyway, making the 7 mana investment sort of unnecessary. This, combined with the fact that the card simply doesn't work in Commander thanks to the singleton nature of the format, puts it at the very bottom of the Ultimatum list. Number 9. The Throne of Eldraine Mythic Artifacts. Best, the Great Henger Embercleave. Worst, the Circle of Loyalty. Throne of Eldraine is known to be one of the strongest sets in the modern era of Magic, but even in an overpowered set like Eldraine, not every card can be busted. Take the less to cast for each mythic artifact cycle from the set. I'm honestly not sure which card from the cycle is strongest. There are 2 incredibly busted options in the Great Henge and Embercleave. Embercleave was arguably stronger in Standard, allowing red aggressive decks to kill out of nowhere, sometimes super early in the game, making it one of the most feared cards in a super powerful Standard format. Meanwhile, the Great Henge saw quite a bit of Standard play too in mono green decks, and is arguably way better than Embercleave in Commander, where it's basically an auto-include in any green deck with big creatures, thanks to the combination of mana production and card advantage it offers. Both cards are busted, but for very different reasons, so I guess let's just call it a tie. On the other side of the cycle, we have the Circle of Loyalty, which has the strictest requirements of any card in the cycle, since its cost reduction only works with knights in specific, and even on the battlefield it's just not that strong. Being an anthem that can make 2/2s for 4 mana just isn't in the same league as drawing a card every time you play a creature, or just literally winning the game with double strike from Embercleave. Even most knight decks choose not to play the Circle of Loyalty. That's how bad it is. Want to try to make this Circle of Loyalty work? Well, you can snag a copy from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Number 8. The Legends Legendary Lands. Best, Karakas. Worst, Teleria. Back in 1994's Legends, Wizards printed the first ever cycle of legendary lands to hilarious results. Each land enters a battlefield untapped, makes a mana of its proper color, and has an extra activated ability. The best member of the cycle by a pretty huge amount is Karakas. The ability to tap a land to bounce a legendary creature to its owner's hand is super powerful, making the land a staple in Legacy, where having a land that can tap to bounce an Emrakul or a Griselbrand is a huge deal. This ability is so strong that Karakas is actually banned in Commander, thanks to its ability to repeatedly bounce opposing commanders, which are always going to be legends. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the blue member of the cycle in Teleria. What mighty ability does this legendary land have? You can tap it, but only during the upkeep, to make a creature lose banding. That's right, Karakas can bounce an Emrakul, while Teleria can slightly annoy a Benelish hero. Even funnier is that all the other lands in the cycle can be activated at instant speed. Well, Urborg's ability to make a creature lose First Strike and Swamp Walk, or Hammerheim's ability to make a creature lose any Landwalk ability isn't great. At least you can use them during combat. Why Wizards felt the need to further power down the least relevant and powerful member of the cycle with a timing restriction we'll probably never know, but I guess that's actually pretty on flavor for a card dealing with banding, a mechanic that pretty much no one understands. Number 7, the Odyssey Atogs. Best, Psychotog. Worst, literally all the other ones. In Odyssey, Wizards printed a 2-color uncommon cycle of Atogs. Each is a 3-mana 1/2 with 2 abilities that can pump it +1/+1 until end of turn, all of which involve sacrificing permanents, discarding cards, or exiling cards from your graveyard. The Atog tribe was basically a meme, these weird toothy creatures that could eat the inedible, led by, of course, Atog, which could eat other Atogs. They're basically horrible joke creatures, except for one. Psychotog. Psychotog, nicknamed Toothy for its impressive set of chompers, quickly became one of the best and most hated creatures in all of Magic. Over the course of the next few years, its ability to grow itself by discarding cards and eating cards from your graveyard made it a staple in control decks in Standard, Extended, and even Legacy. Madness spells like Circular Logic and flashback spells like Deep Analysis turn the downside of discarding a card to pump it into an upside. It Worlds 2002, 6 of the decks in the top 8 were built around Psychotog, including Carlos Romo's winning list. Basically, Psychotog was considered game-breaking and among the best creatures of all time when it was printed. Well, I can't find any record of the rest of the Atog cycle seeing any play at all, which brings them in at number 7 on our list. Number 6, the 5th uncommon equipment. Best, cranial plating. Worst, healer's headdress. Well, perhaps not as scary today thanks to power creep, there was a time when cranial plating was considered to be among the best equipment ever printed. Decks like Affinity that are overflowing with cheap artifact creatures made great use of the equipment, with its ability to give a creature +1/+0 for each artifact you control, often turning a random creature into a 1 or 2 shot threat for the low price of 2 to cast and 1 to equip. In a pinch, you can even move it around at instant speed for just 2 mana. So you probably know cranial plating. It's a pretty iconic card, but did you realize that cranial plating was actually the member of a cycle? Back in 5th Dawn, equipment were a brand new card type, and Wizards decided to give each color a common equipment that could be equipped to a creature for 1 generic mana or attached to a creature at instant speed for 2 colored mana. Cranial plating was the black member of the cycle, with its ability to grant power based on the number of artifacts you control, designed to mimic the Nim from the set. The rest of the cycle did stuff that is more or less stereotypical of its color. The green one gives +1/+1 in trample, the blue one shroud, the red one first strike, and the white one, probably the worst of the cycle, +0/+2 and tap to prevent a damage. All of these look pretty laughably underpowered compared to cranial plating, giving a creature something like +10 power and sometimes killing people in just a single attack. Number 5, the Exodus Oaths. Best, Oath of Druids. Worst, Oath of Mages. The Oath cycle from Exodus is super weird, and it's also one of the most lopsided cycles in the history of the game. Each Oath, well, almost each of them, is a 2-mana enchantment and has a group hug style ability that triggers on each player's upkeep if a certain condition is met. Oath of Lieges gives the player land if an opponent has more land. Oath of Ghouls, a creature from the graveyard if an opponent has more creatures in the graveyard. Oath of Scholars, which for some reason costs 4 mana, double the rest of the cycle, lets you discard your hand and draw 3 cards if an opponent has more cards than you. And Oath of Mages, the worst oath in the cycle, deals a single damage to an opponent if the opponent has more life. As you've probably figured out by now, the big problem with the oaths is that they can benefit your opponent just as much, or in some cases even more than they benefit you. If you're going to spend a card in your mana to cast a spell, you want to get the value from it, not your opponent's, which makes the oath cycle essentially unplayable. Well, except for Oath of Druids. Just like the rest of the oaths, Oath of Druid is symmetrical, and it can work for your opponents just as well as it works for you, but it has a unique condition. If you have less creatures on the battlefield than your opponent during your upkeep, you get to reveal cards from your deck until you find a creature and put it into play for free. Unlike the rest of the oaths, which are difficult or even impossible to control, Oath of Druids is super easy to control. If you just refuse to ever play a creature, it's never going to trigger for your opponent. Players quickly realized that it was pretty easy to abuse Oath of Druids in a control shell. You just overload your deck with counters and removal, and only play a couple of creatures like Morphling to finish the game to find one of your Oath of Druids, and you simply wait until your opponent puts a creature on the battlefield, and then you can play Oath of Druids and get your finisher for free. And this was a plan that Kai Buddha used to win the extended GP Lisbon back in 2002. A few years later, Oath of Druids would become even better once Wizards printed Forbidden Orchard in Kamigawa. The land can tap to make any color of mana, but also give your opponent a 1/1 spirit token, which turned Oath of Druids from a weird control card to a full-on combo piece. With Forbidden Orchard in your deck, you could play Oath, use Orchard to give your opponent a 1/1, and know that your Oath would trigger the following turn. The end result is that today Oath of Druids is a key card in a top-tier deck in Vintage, Magic's most powerful format, that looks to use it to put a Atraxa, Emrakul, or Griselbrand into play as early as turn 2. Number 4. The Throne of Eldraine Common Lands. Best, Mystic Sanctuary. Worst, Idyllic Rage. In Throne of Eldraine, Wizards printed a cycle of common lands that were designed to support the mono-colored theme of the set. If you have 3 other lands of the same type, so 3 islands or mountains or plains or swamps or forests, depending on which land you're playing, the land would enter the battlefield untapped and also give you a small extra bonus. Dwarven Mine would make a 1/1 creature token, Gingerbread Cabin a food token, Idyllic Range put a +1/+1 counter on a creature, and Witch's Cottage put a creature from your graveyard on top of your library. All are fine abilities that offer a little bit of extra value, but nothing game breaking. Except for Mystic Sanctuary. Mystic Sanctuary's ability, putting an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on the top of your library, is way stronger than any of the others in the cycle. Even played fairly, being able to reuse a Wrath or a card draw spell or a counter or removal spell from your graveyard is a pretty strong ability, but its true power is as a combo piece. In Modern, Mystic Sanctuary formed an infinite counter spell lock with Cryptic Command. You could use the Cryptic Command to counter a spell and bounce the Sanctuary back to your hand, and then you could play the Mystic Sanctuary to put the Cryptic Command back on top of your deck and use it again the next turn, or maybe even in the same turn if you had a card drawing planeswalker like Jace the Mind Sculptor to Fairy Hero of Dominaria on the battlefield. Meanwhile, in Commander, infinite turn loops like Trade Routes or Maloko the Clouded Mirror to bounce Mystic Sanctuary back to your hand, alongside an extra turn spell like Time Warp or Walk the Eons to keep putting the extra turn spell on top of your deck, are incredibly annoying and powerful. These synergies led to Mystic Sanctuary being banned in Modern and make it into a groan-inducing finisher in Commander. We've talked about a lot of cycles of cards where one member is super strong and the rest are pretty bad, but in this case, all the the cards are at least somewhat fine, and some are even quite strong, like Dwarven Mind, which powers various indomitable creativity decks in Modern. Mystic Sanctuary is just so far above the rest because it's downright broken. Number 3, the Alliance's free spells. Best, Force of Will. Worst, Scars of the Veteran. I'm sure you know of Force of Will. The Alliance's uncommon is one of the most well-known counter spells in all of Magic, thanks to its ability to be cast for free by exiling a blue card from your hand and paying a life, an ability that has made it perhaps the most important card in Legacy and Vintage, and also a commander staple. But what you probably don't know is that Force of Will is actually part of a cycle. The rest of the cards in the cycle are just so bad you've probably never seen them played. The worst of the 5 is likely Scars of the Veteran, the white member of the cycle, which prevents 7 damage, and if the damage would be dealt to a creature, puts that many +0/+1 counters on that creature. You heard me right, +0/+1, not +1/+1. Old Magic counters are super weird. On the next end step, I guess this means it's actually sort of a free counter spell, but it only can counter lightning bolts or similar spells. While we're on the topic of free counter spells, we also have some honorable mentions here. It turns out that free counters range from very strong to downright broken, and there are 3 other popular free counters that are parts of cycles. Technically, all these cards would deserve spots on our list, but talking endlessly about how free counters are better than everything else in a cycle is pretty boring. So instead of ranking them all individually, I'm just going to mention them all here in chronological order. First, the Future Sight Pax. Pact of Negation's ability being a free counter spell for anything, but you gotta pay 5 mana for it on your next upkeep, allows it to see a lot of play in combo decks. If you win the game on the turn that you cast Pact of Negation, you never gotta worry about paying the cost on your next upkeep. Meanwhile, the worst member of the Pact cycle is the hilariously bad Pact of the Titan, which makes a 4/4 creature that doesn't even have haste or anything, and that makes you pay 5 mana for it on your next upkeep, or else you straight up lose the game. The Modern Horizon Forces. Force Negation was supposed to give Modern their own version of Force of Will, which isn't legal in Modern, and the plan has mostly worked. On the other side of the scale, we have Force of Rage, which makes 2 hasty 3/1s that go away on your next upkeep. The problem is you can only cast the Modern Horizon Forces for free during your opponent's turn, which means if you want to free cast Force of Rage, the tokens never get a chance to attack, and a couple of surprise 3/1 blockers just isn't something that most red decks want. Finally, the Commander 2020 free spells. Last but not least, we have the cycle of free spells from Commander 2020. Like usual, the counterspell, in this case Fierce Guardianship, is the best of the bunch, although really every member of the cycle except the green one, Obscuring Haze, is a format staple in Commander. Well, I'd argue that Obscuring Haze is actually not that bad and that fogs in general are underrated in Commander. The community clearly disagrees. 17% of Commander decks play Fierce Guardianship, despite the fact that until recently it was like a $70 card, but just 1% play the free frog Obscuring Haze, even though it's close to a bulk rare. Number 2, the Urza Saga Legendary Lands. Best, Tolarian Academy. Worst, Shivan Gorge. Early in our list, we talked about the original legendary lands from Legends, headlined by Karakas, while the Urza Saga cycle is even more hilarious. At the top of the cycle, we have Tolarian Academy, which just might be the most powerful land in the entire history of Magic, thanks to its ability to tap to make mana equal to the number of artifacts you control. Since artifacts tend to be cheap, colorless, and the best of them even make mana, Tolarian Academy fueled many absurd combo decks, brought the devastating combo winner to Magic, and ended up being banned in quite literally every format. While not quite as broken as Tolarian Academy, is evidenced by the fact they're still legal to play with, the next 3 members of the cycle are all incredibly powerful as well. Gaia's Cradle is Tolarian Academy, but for creatures, making it a staple in Legacy and Commander, and driving its price up near $1,000. Sarah's Sanctum is Tolarian Academy, but for enchantments, making it an Enchantress All-Star across formats. Meanwhile, Phyrexian Tower is formatted a bit differently. It allows you to sack a creature to make 2 black mana, But lands that tap for 2 mana are still really good. Phyrexian Tower is essentially a pseudo-soul land in the vein of Ancient Tomb, assuming you have some sacrifice fodder. Do you see the pattern here? Every single land in the cycle, in one way or another, makes multiple mana, one of the strongest abilities in all of Magic. But as you've probably noticed, one color's missing. What does the red member of this broken land cycle do? It's gotta be something absurd, right? Well, not exactly. Shiving Gorge, the red member of the cycle, taps for a single colorless mana, or it gives you the ability to pay 3 mana and tap it 2, and drumroll please, deal 1 damage to each opponent. 1 damage! That's right, the blue, white, and green lands regularly tap for like 10 mana. The black one is a sacrifice-based Ancient Tomb, and the red land gives you a 4 mana gut shot that can only hit your opponent's face. Out of all the cycles in all of Magic, I don't think that any color has ever gotten hosed more than red with the Urza Saga legendary land cycle. But this is only number 2 on our list, so what can possibly be number 1? The Alpha 1 mana instance. Best Ancestral Recall. Worst Healing Solve. Back in Alpha, Magic's first ever set, Wizards designed a cycle of 1 mana instants that each involved the number 3 and would help teach players what each color in the game was about. Red is about direct damage, so it got Lightning Bolt, dealing 3 damage, and Lightning Bolt is a cross-format staple to this day, considered by Wizards to be too strong to print in Standard and even banned on Magic Arena. Green, because it's all about beating down with creatures, got Giant Growth to give creatures +3/+3. Black, a color that in the early days of Magic was about bursts of fast mana, got Dark Ritual, which let you turn 1 mana into 3 mana, and the card's still popular in Storm style decks even today. While Lightning Bolt, Dark Ritual, and even Giant Growth are pretty great, Blue did even better in the cycle with Ancestral Recall, a literal member of the Power 9 thanks to its ability to draw 3 cards for a single mana, which puts it on the short list of strongest cards ever printed in Magic. So what iconic spell did White get in the cycle? Hilariously, White actually does have an iconic 1 mana instant in Alpha in Swords to Plowshares, one of the best removal spells in the game's history, but it doesn't have anything to do with the number 3 and it's not part of the cycle. No, that honor belongs to Healing Salve, which for 1 mana gains you 3 life or prevents the next 3 damage. That's right, black makes 3 mana, blue draws 3 cards, green gets +3/+3, red gets 3 damage, and white gains 3 life. An ability so incredibly much worse than everything else in the cycle, and mind-blowingly worse than the best member in the cycle, Ancestral Recall, that it comes in at the very top of our least balanced cycle list, making Alpha's 1 mana instant cycle the least balanced of all time. Looking for even more Magic? Well, check out the video about the fastest bannings in the history of the game, or maybe the one where we played every land destruction legal on Magic Arena just to see what would happen.